Welcome back to Vivid Noise. I'm sure you've heard this one before. I had never heard of Super Monkey Ball until I played Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing. In fact, the same can be said for nearly every franchise represented in that game, aside from maybe Jet Set Radio. Anyway, I got a little curious about the origins of II and decided to spend some time getting familiar with what seemed to be considered the classic entries in his home series. With that said, let's just jump straight into my impressions of the core Monkey Ball formula. If you're not familiar, Super Monkey Ball started out as an arcade game simply called Monkey Ball, which was later adapted to home consoles around the time Sega became a third party. You'd think that being an arcade game that it would require a pretty drastic overhaul in design to make sense for a console release, but Monkey Ball's gameplay style translates surprisingly well. I never expected a game with such nuance in its control, physics, and level design to have such a seamless learning curve. It really did not take me very long to feel comfortable with the controls. I guess I should explain how this game actually works, since there's a good chance some of you guys are like me and have only heard of Monkey Ball but seldom played it. You're technically never in direct control of your character. Moving the analog stick actually causes the entire level to pivot around a certain point, which you then use to manipulate your monkey around the course, almost like one of those marble games. It will take a little while until that becomes apparent, since most of the early stages are quite flat, meaning that for the first dozen or so minutes, your brain is still just going to be telling you that you're controlling the monkey directly and the camera just happens to be moving around a lot. As the game goes on, that mental separation eventually kicks in and you start having to think more about how you're influencing the monkey via the rotation of the world itself. Not only does this unconventional movement system lend itself unexpectedly well to the sensibilities of an arcade gameplay experience, but it also allows the designers to create a wholly unique brand of platforming challenge which you won't find in any other title. The level design in Super Monkey Ball demonstrates a level of understanding of the underlying physics that allows for stages that are challenging but never unapproachable. You'd be surprised how many times the way to get past a certain obstacle is the one that seems too simple to work. Due to the physical properties of the ball, it responds to inertia and differing angles in a way that encourages commitment to whatever you are attempting to pull off. Even if you think you're not going to make it, you might still end up getting farther if you just keep pushing instead of backing out. Remember, the ball has its own momentum that you don't control directly, so stopping on a dime is a no-go. The small amount of precision that Monkey Ball loses due to this movement system, it makes up for with endless potential for all sorts of inventive obstacle courses and, more importantly, creative ways to exploit them. Skipping chunks of levels is almost encouraged with how the level pivoting works, allowing a skilled player to send their monkey flying over set pieces and ending up at the goalposts in record time. Come to think of it, just like Miss Pac-Man Maze Madness, Super Monkey Ball also lacks a dedicated action button. That might have just been a consequence of the original arcade control layout, but by not giving the player a conventional jump button, the developers opened up a world of advanced movement techniques that further solidified the identity of the series. Since you can't just jump over things, most of the level design doesn't necessarily require you to do so, but thanks to the aforementioned physics engine, there are still ways to gain air, even if they weren't intended within the context of the given stage. Having your monkey collide into level geometry at just the right speed and angle allows you to pull off these hops that can bypass certain hazards. The game even encourages this with some level set pieces that exist solely to teach you how to execute such a move. Once again, this proves how familiar the designers were with the systems they had to work with, and as the game gets harder, the level design takes further advantage of both the unique controls and how your monkey responds to collisions. I love the varying shapes and sizes of the different obstacles you have to maneuver around, and oftentimes it's a matter of working with the design rather than trying to outsmart it. There's a few stages where you have to ride along what are essentially railroad tracks, and the challenge lies within controlling your speed so that you don't get derailed. Or anytime the game wants you to balance on a ridiculously narrow pathway, the best approach isn't taking it slow and steady, because you're just going to fall off. But instead, you're going to want to judge how fast you want to be going beforehand and use the physics of the ball to have it lock itself in, so to speak. This is the kind of level design that forces you to go against your instincts in a number of different gameplay situations, and in doing that, Super Monkey Ball leaves a much more substantial impression on you as a player. It's not enough for you to simply know that this game has a weird control scheme. You actively have to apply everything that the game slowly teaches you via its map design and prove that you understand how to maximize your control over both the level and the monkey itself. But what ultimately makes Monkey Ball's unique gameplay work most of all is the fact that it's still inherently intuitive. As I said, although you'll get the most out of this game if you develop a mastery and understanding of the relationship between the physics of the ball and the control you have over the level, if you're satisfied with just playing the beginner and intermediate levels, you aren't 100% required to reprogram your brain or anything. This game's approach to control and design simply allows for a relatively low skill floor and a high skill ceiling. Speaking of beginner and intermediate levels, it only just occurred to me that this game does something that more of these harder than average arcade to home console games should have done. You've probably experienced this before. You're playing a game that has a very old school design philosophy in the sense that you're just going through level after level with no real plot or anything in between, maybe an arcade game or one of those super hard indie platformers. Then there comes a point when the difficulty just becomes unreasonable and you don't ever get a sense of resolution because the whole game is just one long string of levels that only feels complete when you beat them all. Super Monkey Ball avoids this by splitting its challenge mode, which is basically the arcade mode, into 3 difficulties: beginner, intermediate, and expert. Completing any one of these results in you reaching a traditional credit sequence, which, through established convention, makes you feel like you've quote-unquote completed the game. This is really tapping into the psychology of video game design more than anything, but it really makes a difference. If you find yourself getting fed up with the expert stages and still want that resolve from completing a session of playing the game, you can simply play through an easier set of levels and get that feeling. Maybe this wasn't an intentional decision on the developer's part, but regardless, that's the outcome. I think I've got pretty much everything I wanted to talk about regarding the gameplay and design of Monkey Ball out there, and all that's left is to go over the presentation. Super Monkey Ball belongs to that bizarre era of video game visuals where the design sensibilities, composition, and choice of color and all that stuff were still firmly in the 90s. But thanks to the new hardware of the 6th console generation, developers were able to simply push those abstract ideas they had even farther. This is the kind of game where conceptually everything looks like a Photoshop collage or something, but actually rendered in real time with an acceptable level of texture and geometrical detail. Pretty much all of the levels are made up of checkerboard patterns with around 2 or 4 colors, while the backdrops all depict these decisively video game cliche type locations. You know, jungle, desert, ocean, later on you get stuff like an oriental level or a carnival theme. It's that indescribable mix of abstract and concrete, as in depicting something specifically from reality and not up to interpretation. And honestly, with the way this game plays, I don't think there could have possibly been a better choice. By keeping the level geometry and texture so simple, the devs allowed themselves far more freedom as far as how they can design the levels and mix and match different set pieces. I also love how unnatural the sense of scale is. The world around you looks absolutely massive, and you're always suspended above some vast expanse of whatever makes sense for that level's theme. The visuals give off the same kind of vibes as those low-budget marble games, or some of those, at the time, impressive 3D platformers you could play in your browser around the early 2010s. Actually, I think an even more accurate description of the visuals in Super Monkey Ball would be something like the Dreamcast aesthetic, but obviously not on the Dreamcast. That doesn't have anything to do with Sega publishing this game though, since the first few entries were developed by Amusement Vision, who admittedly worked on the Dreamcast version of Daytona USA, so I guess that explains it. The music, on the other hand, feels much more modern in comparison, mixing drum and bass with jazz, acid, blues, and trance, creating a style that is simultaneously unfitting, yet irreplaceable. Like, when you listen to the music in this game on its own, it's hard to believe it comes from a game where a monkey rolls around an abstract obstacle course over a giant washing machine. And yet, I couldn't imagine anything else playing in the background. I'm not gonna say it helps me focus or anything like that. I'm the kind of person who can only concentrate in silence, but the energy this music carries complements the absurdity and surprising complexity of the gameplay. I also can't forget to mention that this game has quite the sense of humor. There's literally a level in this game called URL, which has you trying not to get pushed off the stage by a giant web address. Like an actual address to a site that's probably down or owned by a different company, but you know, that's still pretty funny to me. Or this one level called Pro Skater that has the goalposts going back and forth in a half pipe and you have to freeze it at just the right time with a switch on the floor. Also, the cutscenes have some like serious meme potential. They have this parody of a cartoon thing going on, except they are directed in such a stiff and awkward way that almost feels like a parody of a parody. Even if you're not into this kind of game, do yourself a favor and look up the cutscenes because they are unhinged. Although I would still recommend you try out one of the 6th gen Monkey Ball games. I went with Deluxe since it seems to have the most content. If you're looking for a more up-to-date Monkey Ball game, Banana Animania looks like a good option. It even has some extra accessibility settings to make the harder levels a little more doable. Either way, I had a really good time exploring the origins of a character I previously only knew as a racer in a spin-off of Sega's flagship. And once again, thank you so much for watching another episode of Vivid Noise. I'll see you guys next time.